Okay, I'm sure you guys have already seen the horrors happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank under occupied Palestinian territories in the past week alone. The airstrikes, deaths, Israeli armed forces storming into Palestinian homes and getting violent with civilians and peaceful protesters. On-the-ground reporting, testimonies, and social media have all been great at educating so many of us on what's actually happening over there. I've learned so much, and I'm still discovering new information on this issue daily, so jangan kecamsis, okay? Okay, so I'll be covering a couple segments in this video, namely 1. Why Human Rights Watch and many world leaders are saying Israel is guilty of apartheid, persecution and crimes against humanity, and 2. A brief history of what led to these current events. In 2017, a UN report accused Israel of having established an apartheid regime that oppresses Palestinians there. And just recently, in April 2021, a Human Rights Watch report details why it thinks Israeli authorities are guilty of committing crimes against humanity and persecution. But what is apartheid? Well, the three main elements of apartheid are 1. An intent to maintain dominance of one racial group over another. 2. Systematic oppression of one racial group over another. 3. One or more inhuman acts as part of that oppression. While persecution is defined as unfair or cruel treatment over a long period of time because of race, religion, or political beliefs. Let's start with how Israel has facilitated the transfer of Jewish Israelis to occupied Palestinian territories. And on top of that, they've granted them superior status in civil rights, access to lands, residency rights, and the freedom to move freely and build. Israel retains primary control over borders, airspace, movement of goods and people, security and the registry of the entire population, which dictates legal status and the eligibility to receive identity cards. Okay, remember the inhuman acts mentioned in the apartheid definition earlier? Well, among the inhuman acts identified are forcible transfer, expropriation of landed property, creation of separate reserves and ghettos, denial of the right to leave or return to their country, and the right to nationality. So, there are about 350,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, 2.5 million in the West Bank, and 2 million in the blockaded Gaza Strip. These people are technically stateless. Since they are not recognized as Israeli citizens, they can't vote in the elections, they can't obtain passports, among many other restrictions. Compare that with Israeli citizens who enjoy visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to about 160 countries and territories around the world. Palestinians have no control over the politics and laws that continue to marginalize, terrorize and violently control their lives. That's exactly what's happening in the West Bank. Take the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, for example. Israel recently ordered 6 Palestinian families to vacate their homes to make way for Jewish settlers, despite the fact that these families have been living there for generations. And they're not the first or only family facing dispossession in the area. More than 50 people, including 17 children, are said to be forcibly displaced to make way for more Jewish settlers. Sheikh Jarrah is home to 3,000 Palestinians, most of whom are said to be refugees who were ethnically cleansed from their homes in other parts of Palestine during the 1948 Nakba. Israel has been violently displacing Palestinians and building illegal settlements on their land for decades now.
بيتنا اللي تم الاستيلاء عليه 3/11 10 الصبح ما كانش في حدا في المنطقة واستولوا عليه بطريقة سهلة بمساعدة الشرطة الإسرائيلية.
And now there are more than 500,000 Israelis living in these settlements scattered across the West Bank.
أنا اسمي ثائر عمري 14 سنة. هذا أبوي مازن إرويش. بدي أوريكم كيف أخذوا الدور منا.
25 مستوطن 15 جندي خدشوا على الدار زي النمل الأواعي حطوا لهم كراتين لزقوهم، غرف النوم كسروها زتوها على الأرض، وكل العفش اللي بتلاقوه مكسر.
About a decade ago, the UN predicted that Gaza will be inhabitable by 2020. Today, more than 2 million Palestinians are still living there. So Gaza is governed by Hamas, a party which won political power in the Strip after an election in 2006. And this prompted Israel to impose a strict air, land and sea blockade on Gaza, effectively locking them in and denying access to the rest of the world. This cruel act has stifled economic growth and made Gaza unlivable. More than 80% of the population rely on humanitarian aid for survival. Power cuts happen daily, so Gazans only get about 3 to 6 hours of electricity a day. 97% of Gaza households rely on water delivered by tanker trucks due to little rain and lack of fresh water supply. Their healthcare is in a dire situation because drugs, supplies, and essential equipments like dialysis machines and heart monitors are restricted due to the blockade. There is a severe shortage of housing units, and more than half of the population live below the poverty line. And everything that I mentioned earlier, that's on top of having to live under the constant fear of airstrikes and violence. But did you know Israel has one of the best healthcare systems in the world? It consistently ranks in the top few of ranking systems. And you know what's really sad? Gaza has one of the youngest populations in the world, where over 40% of its people are under the age of 15. This means 2 out of 5 people are infants, toddlers, children, and preteens. Think about that. In just a little over a week, the recent death toll in Gaza has climbed to 212, including 61 children and 36 women. And in the West Bank, 15 Palestinians have been killed. In Israel, 10 have died. From 2008 till 2020, 5,590 Palestinians and 251 Israelis have died in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I'm not saying Israeli lives don't matter. Even the loss of one life is a tragedy. I'm saying the significantly disproportionate deaths on one side indicates that one side has more power than the other. The Israeli army is one of the strongest in the world, consistently ranking in the top 20, while Palestine doesn't even have an army, navy, or air force, all of which Israel has. The Israel Defense Forces has about 170,000 active personnel and about 500,000 in reserves. And their 2020 military budget was $21.7 billion US. Israel is also heavily funded and supported by the US. Just recently, US Senator Bernie Sanders called for a hard look at the nearly $4 billion a year US gives in military aid to Israel yearly. Israel has been one of the largest annual aid recipients from the US since the 70s. I think what people have been doing in the past couple of weeks is shedding a much-needed spotlight on changing the way we discuss this clear disregard for human rights. How did everything get so horrible for Palestinians over there? Here's a brief history. Let's rewind to 1918. After the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, Britain conquered Palestine, or what's today known as Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Prior to the formation of the British Mandate, these lands were predominantly inhabited by an Arab Muslim majority and Jewish minority and Arab Christians under the rule of Ottoman Empire for centuries. Oh, one important bit before I loop her. So Britain had issued the Balfour Declaration, a public pledge declaring its aim to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Late Palestinian American scholar Edward Said called the controversial document one that's made by an European power about a non-European territory in a flat disregard of both the presence and wishes of the native majority resident in that territory. Jews constituted less than 10% of the population at the time, but in the next 3 decades, that changed drastically due to the persecution of Jews in Europe, the Holocaust. Hitler's rise to power increased the number of Jews arriving in Palestine seeking a homeland. Why? Because Britain promised Jews their own land in a place where Arabs made up more than 90% of the population then. This sparked tensions between European Jews and Palestinian Arabs, and also protests against the British government for facilitating and supporting the mass migration of Jews to Palestine. Between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population there rose from 9% to 27% of the total population there. In early 1947, due to the growing tensions, Britain announced that it would be handing over Palestine to the United Nations, ending the British mandate. The UN then recommended a partition of the place into two states, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. And the plan was accepted by Jewish leaders. They declared independence and formed the State of Israel on 14th May 1948. But Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states rejected it because they saw it as a further expansion of European colonialism and declared war on Israel. May 15, 1948 is known as NAKHBA, or catastrophe for Palestinians. It refers to the start of mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their lands. According to Human Rights Watch, more than 700,000 Palestinians fled from Zionist militia attacks on their lands and were forcefully expelled from their homes in the 1948-49 war. More than 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed. And Israel won the war, pushing well beyond the partition boundaries initially suggested by the UN. Jordan took control of the West Bank, while the Gaza Strip went under Egyptian rule. None of the native Palestinians who fled or their descendants have been allowed to return to date. Today, there are more than 7 million Palestinians recognized as refugees by the UN. Most now live in Jordan, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, West Bank, Syria, and Lebanon. And nearly 1/3 of these people live in refugee camps, which the UN itself highlighted to have poor socio-economic conditions. So that means high population density, cramped living conditions, and inadequate basic infrastructure such as roads and sewers. Fast forward to today, the West Bank is nominally under Palestinian Authority and under Israeli occupation, while Gaza is controlled by Hamas, a fundamentalist Islamist party under Israeli blockade. People have been saying that this isn't about religion, nor it is a land dispute issue for Palestinians, and yeah, I agree with them. Because politicians and power-hungry leaders often use religion as a tool to mask their true motives of growing their influence and power. And in which world do land disputes lead to people being violently beaten and thrown out of their homes every few months? And which just court or government would force people out of the homes they've been living in for generations to make way for new settlers? Also, stop being anti-Semitic in the name of supporting Palestinians and their rights to live freely without persecution. Don't try and justify the Holocaust in your efforts to reject the Israeli government. That's sick and cruel. Do you not see all the Jews who are supporting Palestinians and demanding for their freedom? I think if anything, they would know how it feels to be treated like this. And if you don't quite know what I'm talking about, I think it's time to read up on the horrors of Nazi ethnic cleansing during World War II and what the Hitler regime was all about. Because when I was reading up on what's happening in Palestine, I couldn't help but to draw comparisons between both. Support Palestinians because you believe in human rights. For so long, a lot of people have made it seem like supporting Palestinians is like a religious brotherhood thing versus just standing up for people who are persecuted and treated barbarically. Let's take away the whole umat Islam mesti pertahankan Palestine and instead keep sharing and educating each other on why this is a human rights issue and we should all care about it regardless of our faiths.